everybody. Welcome to Political Badger. I'm Jack Thompson. Thanks for joining us. I can't tell you how excited I am about today's guest. He is a former U.S. representative from Michigan. He served as the director of the Office of Management and Budget under President Ronald Reagan. He spent many years on Wall Street, first at Salomon Brothers and then later as an original partner at the Blackstone Group. His 2013 book, The Great Deformation, is an absolute masterpiece. If you haven't read it, you're really missing out. So do yourself a favor and buy it immediately. In fact, to me, it's the most important book, certainly of the 2000s, and ought to be required reading for all members of Congress. I'm a big fan of his work, and I'm very happy to welcome David Stockman to the show. Joining us now is David Stockman. David, thanks so much for coming on.
Very happy to be with you.
You know, one of the things I love about your work is I've noticed a lot of your stuff sort of traces historical dominoes, so to speak. So, for example, your book, The Great Deformation, traces the path America went down, politically and fiscally and monetarily that led us to the era of, bubble finance that we're in the midst of today. Could you take a few minutes and kind of walk us through the chain of events that led us to '08 and where we are now, maybe starting with FDR?
Yeah, actually, it probably starts in 1914 when the Fed opened for business. Strangely enough, at that time, the Fed was not allowed to buy government debt of any kind, bonds or notes or bills. It was meant to be a passive banker's bank to provide liquidity to the commercial banking system of America based on real bills, which is to say inventory loans or receivables paper that could be brought to the central bank by local bankers discounted for cash in the event that they needed to expand or to pay off depositors. So therefore, there was no monetary central planning. There was no targets for inflation or unemployment or housing starts or GDP. In fact, they didn't even measure GDP then. The idea was the economy was the work of the people. It was the work of the free market. Millions of investors and savers and producers and consumers and even speculators interacting, and the outcome would be what it would be, whether it was 5% growth or 1% growth. It wasn't the business of the state, and it wasn't the business of the central bank. That's the model we started with. Then came along World War I. The incipient Fed was drafted into the service of war finance. Its powers were extended to intervene in the debt market, essentially monetize government debt to help finance the huge mistake we made of entering World War I when there was really no reason for it or interest involved. But that started the Fed down to the long road towards where we are today. In the 1920s, the Fed began to have an active so-called open market intervention program. It began to try to target interest rates to drive the economy. Unfortunately, that led to the great bubble of the roaring 20s and the crash in 29. There's a complex set of global reasons why the Great Depression happened, but it wasn't the fault of some inherent flaw in capitalism. It was the boom that had been triggered by first the war and then the Fed and other central banks in the 20s. All the wrong lessons were learned. Out of the 30s came the whole idea that capitalism is inherently fragile, prone to constant stumbling and recession and depression, and therefore you need activist fiscal and central bank policy to continually put it back on track. That is a huge mistake, but that became the established policy. For a while after World War II, we had some good leaders, leaning against the wind of what I would call the Keynesian consensus. Eisenhower didn't buy it. He balanced the budget. It was his number one priority. William McChesney Martin, who was head of the Fed for 19 years during that era, didn't buy it. He thought his mission was price stability, a sound financial system, and then let the private economy go its own way. Unfortunately, in the 1960s, the Keynesians took over policy in the Kennedy-Johnson administration. Johnson created the disaster of Vietnam, coupled with the Great Society, the so-called guns and butter budget and deficits. That created a crisis that forced the Fed into money printing to essentially monetize Johnson's deficits. Inflation took off. The dollar began to weaken. Foreigners began to accumulate too many dollars and pressured our commitment to convert dollars into gold at a fixed rate. That was the whole Bretton Woods system, and it pretty well. And eventually we hit the wall, and Nixon basically then made the huge mistake that's led to the present time. In August 1971, he basically defaulted on the U.S. obligation to convert dollars to gold, shut down the gold window, freed the dollar to float, and more importantly, freed the Federal Reserve to print as much or as little money as it wanted without any external restraint or without any external anchor. And it was only a matter of time. We had the great inflation as a result of that. Volcker did cure it, but he was the last of the Mohicans, so to speak, last of the honest central bankers. Greenspan came in. He soon crowned himself the maestro, thought that he could use interest rate pegging and manipulation to drive the economy to bigger and greater prosperity. It was a huge mistake. It led to the dot-com bubble. Instead of learning anything after the crash, he doubled down, drove interest rates to 1% in 2003, fueled the housing boom, and then along with Bernanke, who said the great moderation has arrived and the central bank has abolished the business cycle and it's onward and upward forever. Yes, they led it onward and upward right into the most ridiculous housing bubble, financial bubble in history, the crash of 2008. And then, for the third time, we doubled down even more fantastically when Bernanke took over and just let the printing presses at the Fed rip. The balance sheet of the Fed in that short interval went from $900 billion at the time of the Lehman crisis in September 2008. And remember, it had taken 94 years of sort of plucking money out of thin air to get the Fed to that level. Bernanke doubled the $900 billion to $1.8 trillion in 6 weeks, if you can imagine that, and then tripled it by the end of the year, and here we are now at $4.5 trillion, up 5 times in the last 5 or 6 years. The worst thing is all of this monetary madness was exported to the rest of the world, so to speak. The ECB is doing it, the Bank of England is doing it, the People's Printing Press of China is doing the same thing, and the Bank of Japan is, literally gone mad off the deep end at the rate at which they're printing money today. So the whole world is caught up in a fantastic and destructive central bank money printing spree that it's only a matter of time, in my judgment, before all of this hits the wall. In fact, we're beginning to see some of the cracks and fissures and fractures developing in the global bubble that is underway in some of the developments that we see almost on a daily basis.
Now, given the rampant money printing around the world that you mentioned, why have we not seen more inflation?
Everything. And as a result of that, there is, complete and total downward pressure on the price of goods and to some degree the price of services. Labor was temporarily flushed out of the rice paddies of China into the export factories, causing a huge labor deflation around the world. As goods prices were held to the zero line or even negative, it kept the reported price indices, which are basically current goods and services consumption at low levels. But all of that liquidity, all of that fiat credit created by the banks, central banks, essentially never got outside of Wall Street, the canyons of Wall Street, or London for that matter, and was channeled into endless speculation and sort of carry trade bidding for financial assets. And so today, all financial assets, stocks, bonds, until the recent break, commodities were overvalued. Now what's happening is we're beginning to see, the day of reckoning settle in, because there's way too much capacity to produce liquid fuels or petroleum in the world compared to the sustainable demand. Finally, the central banks are beginning to realize, at least in Washington, maybe in Beijing and elsewhere, that they just can't continue this mad rate of money printing. And as a result of that, confidence is beginning to fracture and reality is beginning to set in. So the short answer is the kind of global monetary expansion and monetary excess that we've had now for 2 decades leads to deflation in the long run, not to the kind of hyperinflation of the 1920s in Germany that people use as a model. And the real inflation that comes out of this process is the vast overpricing, overvaluation of financial assets, and the crash that is going to occur one of these days down the road is in the stock index, is in the price of sovereign debt, derivatives, and all the rest of it, not in the CPI per se. I would expect further downward pressure on the CPI.
Now, given we're at zero interest rates, basically, what do you see the Fed doing next time we have a downturn? Are they going to ramp up the printing presses even more somehow with more QE, or what?
I think that's a great question. I think that's why we're near what I would call the end game of the era of rampant central bank money printing. Last time, Bernanke got away with it when he turned on the printing press, as I described before, on September 15, 2008, at the time of the Lehman bankruptcy, by arguing that the economy was in trouble, that it could be stimulated or jump-started with lower interest rates. The interest rate at that point in the overnight market or federal funds market was 5.5%. So massive money printing drove the interest rate down. That seemed logical to a lot of people, and therefore they were able to get away with it, for 5 years. Now, it turns out that didn't stimulate anything except a huge bubble in the financial market. That being said, today they don't have the cover that they need to stimulate the economy by taking a moderate interest rate down to zero. They are at zero. They are at the zero bond. So my conclusion is that if they would, in response to a big market correction, let's say in the order of 20% in a quick plunge, if they were to turn on the printing press again, in other words, relapse to massive QE, it would fail completely because there would be no cover story. Even the traders who were addicted to this Fed liquidity would be frightened beyond belief by a return to QE when supposedly QE solved everything. And it would compound the confidence collapse and the market decline rather than turn it around. as it did during the fall and winter of 2008, 2009. So I think, in short, they're out of dry powder. They've shot their wad, so to speak.
Right.
They're at the zero bound, and the next leg down in terms of a financial crisis will be, without that kind of intervention tool available.
Now, I want to change gears a little bit. I mentioned earlier how a lot of your stuff traces historical dominoes. I've heard you talk about how our entry into World War I essentially set a chain of events in motion that gave us all sorts of awful things and ultimately resulted in this massive war machine we have today. Can you walk us through the chain of events that were set off by Wilson's decision to enter the war?
Yeah, well, first, World War I itself was madness. There was no reason for it in Europe per se. It was one, mistake and a string of errors after another that led to the greatest conflagration and kind of military and industrial disaster that had been known to history up until then. But the point was, by 1917, both sides were bankrupt, both sides were morally and fiscally and psychologically exhausted. The war had ground to a bloody stalemate in the trenches of northern France, and had the United States remained on the sidelines as it should have, because it didn't have a dog in that hunt, it was only a matter of months, in my judgment, before a piece of exhaustion would have been arrived at, as opposed to a Carthaginian peace, so to speak, that came in 1919, because the Allies were able to win due to the massive fresh manpower in military capacity of the United States. Now, why is that important? The difference between the disaster of the Versailles settlement in 1919 and a piece of exhaustion within Europe in 1917. Very simply, had the latter scenario unfolded as it was more or less ready to occur in the spring of 1917, I doubt whether a small band of fanatics would have been put in a rail car, given a couple $1 million worth of gold by the Germans, desperate as they were, in 1917, and sent to Russia in a boxcar, as Lenin famously was. In other words, there wouldn't have been the Leninist coup in the fall of 1917. There wouldn't have been the rise of the bloody dictatorship and totalitarianism of the Soviet Union, Lenin and Stalin and the rest. Secondly, there wouldn't have been a defeated and humiliated and bankrupt Germany that became the feeding ground for Nazism, and essentially a massive army that was demobilized and left to fend for itself at the end of the Versailles Conference in 1919. That was the combustible tinder. That was the resentment and feeling. That's where the resentment and desire for revenge was injected into German politics and eventually led to Nazism, Hitlerism, World War II, the Holocaust, and all the rest of it. So change history and say that Hitler and the Nazi era wouldn't have happened, that Lenin and the Soviet Union wouldn't have materialized. The world would have spent itself in a totally different modality in the 20s and 30s. There wouldn't have been World War II. Without World War II, there wouldn't have been a Cold War, because obviously what happened was when the war ended, the two sides had divided up Europe at Yalta between the Soviet sphere and the U.S. and British sphere. And if you look at the history carefully after 1945 and the unfortunate use of the atomic bomb on Japan by Truman, and many of the other, developments that we don't have time to go into here, it's pretty clear that the Cold War didn't need to happen, but certainly, obviously, is only a derivative and accident that came out of, the conflagration of World War II. Finally, with no Cold War, we wouldn't have had the United States imperium, as I call it, the Cold War buildup of defense capacity of the CIA, of all the interventions and coups and sort of Pax Americana that was attempted to be imposed around the world in the name of fighting the Cold War. Without that, you wouldn't have had the Reagan defense buildup, which really was a conventional armada that became the basis for the disastrous interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan and the rest of the madness that we have underway today. So that is kind of a contrafactual history. That's a obvious, it could have been different. But I think if you look at it carefully, it's not a case that it could have been different. It's an absolute certainty that it would have been different and much better for the planet and for mankind and for the people of America and the rest of the world. So, there are inflection points in history. There are hinge points. And I think one of those was obviously the assassination at Sarajevo in June 1914, and the unfortunate decision of one man who was incompetent to be President of the United States. Woodrow Wilson is the worst president we had, probably short of George Bush. And yet he was sitting in that Oval Office and made a calamitously wrong decision when he led the U.S. into World War I.
Well, it's fascinating stuff, and unfortunately, David, we're just about out of time. Next time I want to ask you about the chain of events that led us to ISIS. But could you tell the folks the best place to go if they want to follow your work?
Yes, I have a blog that we post a lot of things on daily. It's called David Stockman's Contra Corner. Contra as in contrarian. You can easily find it by Googling that name. And you can then simply click on for a daily email. It comes once a day at 5 o'clock. We have Eastern Time. We have 10 or 15 articles published each day. I write myself, as well as repost other people that are dealing with what I call the issues of the warfare state, the welfare state, the runaway central banks, the casino on Wall Street, and all the other issues that come in between.
Well, we'll certainly link up to that on our website and in the show notes, and I can't recommend your website enough to folks. And again, I really enjoyed it. Thanks so much for coming on, and let's do it again.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
All right, everybody, that's our show for today. I hope you enjoyed my chat with David Stockman. Make sure to sign up for his newsletter at davidstockmanscontracorner.com. I'm telling you, it's absolutely indispensable. Coming up on the show, we have Eric Margolis and Paul Craig Roberts once again, so stay tuned for that. Make sure to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at @PollyBadger. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the show on iTunes. A big thanks to David Stockman for coming on, and until next time, peace.